exercise. Whenever we're exercising and the higher the intensity of the exercise, the more oxygen is used, okay? So just think running, weightlifting, swimming, whatever it is, the higher the intensity, okay, the stronger the exercise is, the more oxygen will be used, okay? So how will the body be able to meet this increased need for oxygen? Okay, like I told you guys, when the higher the intensity of the exercise is, the more oxygen the body needs, okay? But how will it meet this increased need for oxygen? We have more than one way, okay? Number one is increased blood flow to the active muscles, okay? So let's say you're running, okay? There will be increased blood flow to your skeletal muscles in your legs, okay? How is this achieved? It's achieved by more sympathetic stimulation. When we increase sympathetic stimulation, heart rate and stroke volume will increase, okay? And because of the increase in stroke volume, there will be an increase in systolic pressure during exercise, because if I pump out more blood of the heart, the aorta is receiving more blood, right? So the systolic pressure will be higher because it's receiving more blood, okay? So that's the first mechanism. The second way is that the active muscles will be able to extract more oxygen from the blood. So the blood can carry a set amount of oxygen, okay? We have the red blood cells containing hemoglobin. Oxygen binds to the hemoglobin. So it contains a set amount of oxygen. Now, those muscles are able to extract more oxygen than usual when they're exercising. It's due to the Bohr effect, which will be covered in your respiratory lectures, okay? So, like we said, when we're exercising, we need more oxygen. How is the body able to meet this increased need? By two ways. One of them is that we will increase blood flow to the active muscles, so we will send more blood to the muscles that are doing the job. So if you're running, there will be a lot of blood sent to your skeletal muscles in your legs. Okay, how is this achieved? By higher sympathetic stimulation, which gives us a high heart rate and stroke volume, okay? The second way is that those active muscles, those muscles that are working very hard, will be able to take more oxygen from the blood. Now, when sympathetic stimulation increases, this will lead to an increase in heart rate and stroke volume. This also increases systolic pressure during exercise. We already covered this, but as a refresher, when we activate the sympathetic system, our heart rate will go up. So our heart will start beating faster and our stroke volume will go up. So essentially, the amount of blood that we're pumping out with every single beat is more. Okay, and this is why we have high systolic pressure, because we're sending the aorta more blood during systole. This is why the systolic pressure will increase. Cardiac output will increase as well. Now, what is cardiac output? Cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. Heart rate goes up, stroke volume goes up. So it's only by logic that cardiac output will go up. What is cardiac output? It's the amount of blood that the heart pumps out every minute. So stroke volume is with every beat, and cardiac output is in every minute, okay? So cardiac output increases because the stroke volume increased, because the heart rate increased. But how did this happen? ESV, which is end systolic volume, decreases. What is end systolic volume? End systolic volume is the amount of blood that's left in the heart after a contraction. So that amount of blood decreases. Why? Because we have higher contractility, which means that the heart is pumping harder, okay? So most of the blood will be pumped out of the heart. Not much will be left inside of it. So this contributes to the increase in cardiac output. One more thing that contributes is that the EDV increases. What is the EDV? It's the end diastolic volume, which is essentially the amount of blood that's sitting in the heart at the end of relaxation. During relaxation, the heart is filling with blood, right? So when we're exercising, the EDV will go up even more. It will increase. Why? Because we have more venous return. So essentially, more blood is going back to the heart because the veins are constricting and they're sending all that blood back to the heart. So EDV increases, okay? So again, we said sympathetic stimulation will increase, and this will lead to a high heart rate and a high stroke volume. This will lead to cardiac output increasing. There are two important factors that also contribute. It's that ESV decreases because I'm sending that blood out. The heart is contracting very strongly, so only very little amount of blood is left after the contraction. And EDV increases because I'm sending all that blood back to the heart so that the heart can pump it out, okay? Now, during exercise, the cardiac cycle shortens. What does this mean? So normally the cardiac cycle takes about 800 milliseconds. During exercise, it becomes 300 to 350 milliseconds. Just keep it as a general rule of thumb is that when the heart rate increases, the cardiac cycle will shorten. This is normal, okay? Because it only makes sense that if the heart rate is increasing, the cardiac cycle will have to shorten to accommodate to that increased heart rate, right? Because every beat will take a lesser time than normal. This is why the cardiac cycle will shorten, okay? Systole duration decreases, so the duration of contraction will go down. And the slow filling phase, which is the diastasis, this happens during relaxation, will decrease as well, but this decreases significantly, okay? So both the contraction phase and the relaxation phase will decrease, but what decreases significantly is the relaxation phase, specifically the slow filling phase or diastasis, okay? So this is the phase where the heart is filling with blood, right? So this phase where the heart is filling with blood is shortened during exercise. This is where the atrial contraction part of the cardiac cycle becomes very important because the atria will contract to push out that last bit. It's about 10 to 15% of blood sitting in the atrium. It will contract and send it to the ventricles to maintain end diastolic volume and stroke volume. Because if the heart rate becomes way, way too high, the slow filling phase decreases so much that the heart is not able to be filled with enough blood. So this atrial contraction contributes. It will contract the atria and send out that blood to the ventricle. This way, the amount of blood that's sitting in the heart at the end of relaxation, which is EDV, will be maintained. And stroke volume, which is what we pump out with every beat, will be maintained as well because of the atrial contraction. Ventricular and aortic systolic pressures will increase during exercise. Now, why does the ventricular pressure increase? Because of the high contractility. And why does the aortic systolic pressure increase? Because, again, contractility is high. We're sending out that blood to the aorta. So it's only biologic that the pressure will increase. If it's accommodating more blood, the pressure will increase. Now, something that's very important to note is that if the heart rate becomes very, very high, the systolic and diastolic, which is the contraction and relaxation phases of the cardiac cycle, will shorten significantly. And stroke volume will start to decrease due to the reduced ventricular filling time. Now, normally, we said here, when I told you guys here, stroke volume increases, right? But if the heart rate becomes very, very high, the heart will not be able to fill with enough blood because the relaxation phase has decreased so much that the heart is not able to get enough blood in. This will eventually lead to the stroke volume decreasing, okay? So normally, with high physical activity, stroke volume should increase. But if the heart rate increased to a very, very high point, then stroke volume will eventually start decreasing because the cardiac cycle has shortened so much that it's not able to fill the heart with enough blood. Okay, so please don't confuse this. Yes, normally when the heart rate goes up, stroke volume should increase as well. But if the heart rate goes to a very, very high rate, it will not be able to fill the heart with enough blood because the relaxation phase where we send blood back to the heart, where we're taking blood in the heart will decrease, so stroke volume will decrease because if I'm not filling the heart with enough blood, the heart will not have enough blood to pump out with every beat, okay? So cardiac output increases, right, during exercise. This happens due to two things, due to an increase in stroke volume and an increase in heart rate. both are brought upon by the increase in sympathetic activity. Okay, so the increase in stroke volume happens due to two things: increased venous return and decreased contractility. So increased venous return, why does this happen? Because when we increase the sympathetic activity, the veins will start contracting, okay? So their compliance will decrease. Remember when we said that veins are normally very compliant and can hold a big amount of blood in them? When we increase the sympathetic activity, the veins will contract, okay? We're constricting the veins. So their compliance will go down. They won't be able to hold that much blood inside them anymore. So this blood will be sent back to the heart. This is why venous return increases, okay? And for here, I apologize. There's a mistake. This should be increased contractility, not decreased contractility. I'm sorry, but I prepared those slides in a rush because I wanted you guys to have them as quick as possible. So please fix this. It should be increased contractility. And when the slides are uploaded on the drive, I'll make sure that this is fixed. Okay, but this should be increased contractility. Okay. Cardiac output increases because of increase in stroke volume and an increase in heart rate. What brings this increase in heart rate? The increase in sympathetic activity and a decrease in parasympathetic activity. Sympathetic activity will cause the heart to pump faster, and the parasympathetic activity, I don't want this to start working right now, so there will be decreased parasympathetic. So again, cardiac output increases because of two parameters: stroke volume going up, heart rate going up. Why the stroke volume increase? Because we're sending more blood back to the heart. That's increased venous return, and because we're contracting the heart stronger, okay? Now, why does the heart rate increase? Because of the increase in sympathetic activity. Okay, now for aerobic conditioning. What is aerobic conditioning? Aerobic conditioning is essentially the set of cardiovascular changes that happen due to long-term exercise. So basically, think athletes, football players, tennis players, marathon runners. These people spend a lot of their time exercising, okay? And they do it for like years and years. So when this happens, certain cardiovascular changes will start happening because of their long-term exercise, okay? Now, what are these changes? Decreased heart rate. Why does the heart rate decrease? Because there's an increase in resting vagal tone. Now, what is vagal tone? This is basically the vagus nerve firing, okay? So at rest, the vagus nerve fires more in athletes. This is why their heart rate is decreased, okay? This is a pretty well-known fact. I'm sure most of you guys know this, but yes, athletes have a lesser heart rate. Sometimes it can even be bradycardic, but this is normal because they have an increase in vagal tone, okay? The second thing that changes is that their ventricles become bigger, okay? We call this eccentric hypertrophy. So basically the heart rate, the ventricles dilate, they become bigger. Why do they become bigger? To accommodate more stroke volume at rest. Because athletes by nature, not by nature, because of their long-term exercise, their body develops this mechanism and their stroke volume becomes more at rest, okay? So the amount of blood that they send out of the heart with every beat is higher, okay? So their ventricles become bigger so that they can fill in more blood, okay? The third thing that changes is they will have angiogenesis. Now, what is angiogenesis? Angio means vessels and genesis means making. So essentially, they'll have formation of new vessels around the heart and skeletal muscles. This is basically so that the oxygenation and the oxygenation process becomes easier, and so that the muscles will be able to have increased blood flow to them. Okay, and actually this formation of new vessels around the heart is protective against heart attacks, okay? You don't really need to know this, it's just a fun fact, okay? But because they have a lot of vessels around their heart, if an occlusion happens in one vessel, the other vessels will be able to maintain blood flow. That's called collateral flow. And this is what kind of protects them from heart attacks. Next, we have this diagram. It's an important one, so bear with me. High physical activity leads to an increase in sympathetic activity systemically and a local effect. This local effect is basically what's happening at the muscle level, okay? So we want to explore the effects of high physical activity systemically and locally. Systemically, we will have an increase in sympathetic activity, like we said, right? So this will increase cardiac output. Why? Because we increased heart rate, we increased stroke volume. Now, when cardiac output increases, mean arterial pressure, which is basically our blood pressure, will increase, right? Because we're sending more blood out to those arteries. So those arteries are filling with more blood, right? This is why the mean arterial pressure increases. And increased systemic vasoconstriction, okay? This is because all the veins and arteries will contract because of the sympathetic activity. So this leads to an increase in total peripheral resistance. Now, locally, we have massive vasodilation in exercising muscles. So all the arterioles that are directly supplying those skeletal muscles that are exercising, they will have vasodilation. So the vessels will dilate, they will become bigger because of the carbon dioxide and adenosine that are accumulating, okay? So when we're exerting a lot of physical activity, certain biochemical processes will start happening, and CO2, carbon dioxide and adenosine will accumulate. Now, when these accumulate, they will cause the vessels at the level of the muscles to vasodilate. This will decrease total peripheral resistance. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is contradicting. Over here, there's an increase in total peripheral resistance, and over here, there's a decrease. Now, you're right, but keep in mind that this is systemic and this is local. So the overall effect that happens is a decrease in total peripheral resistance. Why? Because the massive vasodilation that happens here is way higher than what happens here, okay? So this is why the overall effect is a decrease in total peripheral resistance, okay? So as a recap, when we have high physical activity, there's a systemic effect and a local effect at the level of the muscles. Systemically, we will increase sympathetic activity. This will lead to high cardiac output, which gives us a high arterial pressure, and increased systemic vasoconstriction because of the sympathetic effect. The vessels will start constricting, which increases the resistance. Locally, we have vasodilation of the arterioles that will go directly to support the muscles. They will vasodilate, so they will become larger in diameter, and this will cause a decrease in the resistance. So overall, if you are asked about the effect of total peripheral resistance during exercise, you will say decrease. Why? Because that's the overall effect. If they ask you systemically, you can say high total peripheral resistance because of the systemic vasoconstriction. But if they ask about the overall effect, how does total peripheral resistance change during exercise? It decreases because the vasodilation that happens here is much more significant because we have a lot of arterioles that are supporting the muscles and all of them will vasodilate. So the effect that happens here is much more significant, leading to an overall decrease in total peripheral resistance. I really hope you guys understood this. Now, what happens to the PV loop during exercise? End diastolic volume, which is the amount of blood that's sitting in the heart, increases because of decreased venous compliance and increased venous return. So what is decreased venous compliance? Didn't I tell you guys that veins will start constricting because of the sympathetic activity? So when veins start constricting, they're sending out all that blood back to the heart. This is what increases venous return. So if I'm sending that blood back to the heart, the amount of blood during at the end of relaxation will be increased because I have greater filling of the heart, okay? Systolic blood pressure increases because of the high sympathetic activity and contractility. So like I told you guys, we have high sympathetic activity. This constricts some arteries, and this will lead to an increase in systolic blood pressure. The high contractility will allow us to send more blood to those vessels, which further increases their blood pressure. ESV, which is the amount of blood that's sitting in the ventricle at the end of contraction, will decrease because of the increased contractility. So the heart is pumping out harder. So there's not much blood left in the heart at the end of contraction. Why? Because the contraction is so hard and we're sending all that blood out. Okay? Stroke volume increases, like we said, due to the effect of sympathetic. And this will lead to an increase in heart rate. This happens because of an increase in heart rate and cardiac output. Okay. I'm sorry, guys. I keep misspeaking. Stroke volume increases, heart rate increases, and cardiac output increases. Now, when stroke volume and heart rate increase, this leads to an increase in cardiac output. This equal should be here. Okay, should be after heart rate. Okay, so stroke volume increases, heart rate increases. When you multiply stroke volume by heart rate, this leads to an increase in cardiac output. Stroke work increases, which is basically the area of the PV loop. Now over here, you guys can see EDV, which is basically the amount of blood at the end of relaxation, has increased because the compliance of the veins decreased so much and it's sending all that blood back to the heart. So this was it normally. This is how it is now. It increased, okay? You can see that systolic blood pressure has increased because of the high contractility and the sympathetic activity. You can see that the ESV, the amount of blood at the end of contraction, okay, the ESV has decreased. This is how it is normally. This is how it is now. It has decreased because the contractility is so high that it's sending all that blood out. And stroke work, which is basically all this area, has increased. This was the area before, the area in black, and this is how it is now, the area in red. Now, when mean arterial pressure increases during exercise, why is that not counteracted by baroreceptor reflex? Now remember, we said the baroreceptor reflex is the reflex that restores arterial pressure back to mean arterial pressure back to normal, whether that was a change that decreased the mean arterial pressure or increased it. It is the reflex that will bring it back to normal. Now during exercise, mean arterial pressure increases. Why is the baroreceptor reflex not working? Because the baroreceptors are reset to fire at a higher point. What does this mean? The brain knows that we are exercising, so it will send out signals that will reset the firing point of baroreceptors, okay? So let's say if they used to fire at this point, now they will fire at this point, okay? Because they know that we are exercising and that this mean arterial pressure increase that happened is normal and it's due to our exercise. Now, one thing to know is that this reset that happens is reversible. So once you're done exercising, the firing point of baroreceptors will go back to normal. But in chronic hypertension, the change is not reversible. The baroreceptors are set to fire at a higher point, and this is how it remains for the rest of their life. You don't really need to know the point about chronic hypertension, but I thought I'd mention it because it was in your slides, but I don't think it's very important. You just need to know that during exercise, baroreceptors, the brain knows that we are exercising, so it will tell the baroreceptors to fire at a higher point, okay? So if it increased till here, let's say, the baroreceptors will not do anything because their firing point is here now, okay? This is basically everything we explained so far. I broke down this table in the slides because I know that these tables were a bit confusing, but I'll go through it very quickly. So when we are exercising, there's a local response and there's a nervous system or systemic response. This systemic response is basically an increase in sympathetic activity and a decrease in parasympathetic activity. When sympathetic activity increases, this leads to an increase in heart rate and contractility. When contractility increases, stroke volume, which is the amount of blood we send out of the heart with every beat, increases. Now, both the increase in heart rate and stroke volume will cause the cardiac output to increase. When cardiac output increases, this will increase mean arterial pressure because the arteries are accommodating more blood, which will cause an increase in systolic blood pressure. Okay? This leads to an increase in pulse pressure, which is basically the difference between systolic and diastolic, which makes sense because if systolic blood pressure has increased, the difference between them will be higher. Now, this also, this systemic response leads to higher resistance at the arterioles and a lower venous compliance. This higher resistance in the arterioles will increase total peripheral resistance, right? And this decrease in venous compliance will constrict the veins to send the blood back to the heart, which increases venous return, increasing left ventricular preload, or essentially EDV, which is the amount of blood in the ventricle at the end of relaxation. So this means that we're filling the heart with more blood, okay? Now for the local effect, there's high activity at the skeletal muscle level, high metabolite production, which like I told you guys, that includes carbon dioxide, adenosine, lactate, hydrogen, all these stuff will cause active hyperemia. Active hyperemia basically means the local vasodilation that happens at the level of skeletal muscles due to exercise. This causes a decrease in resistance, right? So the increase in resistance that happens here systemically and the decrease that happens here locally here is way more significant. That's why our overall effect during exercise is a decrease in total peripheral resistance. This decrease in total peripheral resistance decreases diastolic blood pressure, which further contributes to the fact that pulse pressure will increase because there's a higher difference between them now. And the overall effect is that we have higher blood flow to the active muscles because of the vasodilation that happened here and because of the increase in cardiac output. That was a lot. Now we'll move on to questions. So you guys can pause this and read it at your own, but I will keep on explaining them, okay? Because this is a recorded session. At the onset of exercise, which of the following normally happens? The answer here is B, increased venous constriction. So like we said, we have sympathetic activity firing. This causes constriction at the level of arteries and veins both. When you constrict the veins, that blood will go back to the heart, okay? So this is the first question. For the second question, which of the following events normally happens during exercise? So again, this is vasoconstriction. Here it was venous constriction, so the veins. Here it's vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction basically means all vessels, which is correct because both veins and arteries are constricting due to the increased sympathetic activity, okay? A healthy 22-year-old female medical student has an exercise stress test. An increase in which of the following is most likely to occur in this woman's skeletal muscles during exercise? So all of the above. Why? Because remember when we said skeletal muscles during exercise, there's very high activity in them, right? So the first thing that happens is high vascular conductance. High vascular conductance basically means that there's a lot of blood moving there, okay? So this is right. High blood flow, because like we said, we have a lot of cardiac output going there. High carbon dioxide concentration, because of the high activity, metabolites will accumulate, and arteriolar diameter will also increase because of the local vasodilation that happens, which basically means all of the above. Next, a healthy 25-year-old male medical student has an exercise stress test. Which of the following sets of physiological changes is most likely to happen in this man's skeletal muscles during exercise? The answer here is G. Arteriolar resistance will go down at the level of skeletal muscles, okay? Arteriolar resistance will go down because of the local vasodilation. Adenosine concentration will go up. Remember, I told you guys metabolites like carbon dioxide, adenosine, lactate, hydrogen will increase. And vascular conductance, which is basically blood moving there, will increase.